The first thing I remember is the sound of his voice filling the room. Not loud enough to shake the walls, not sharp enough to scare the neighbors, just firm, tight, controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to rise because it already carried weight. I was standing near the edge of the living room, close to the hallway where the light faded into shadow. He was facing me, shoulders squared, jaw set. I don't remember the exact words he said. I never do. What stays with me is the feeling that came before the words even landed. That tightness in the chest, the way my stomach dropped before I fully understood why. I knew I had done something wrong, or at least something that didn't fit the rules. In our house, there were many rules, and not all of them were spoken out loud. Some lived in the air, some lived in the silence that followed a mistake. As he spoke, calmly but with clear frustration, I watched the floor instead of his face. I learned early that looking up didn't help. Looking down felt safer. The room felt smaller in those moments, as if the walls leaned in to listen too. There was no physical harm, no shouting, no slamming doors, and yet my body reacted as if something heavy had already happened. My hands felt stiff at my sides. My breath slowed, not because I was calm, but because I didn't want to make noise. Even breathing felt like something that could be done wrong. I stood there, nodding slightly, absorbing every word, every pause, every sigh that slipped out when he finished speaking. When he turned away, the silence stayed behind. That silence was familiar. It followed me more than his voice ever did. It settled into the room like dust, resting on the furniture, the carpet, the corners of my thoughts. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there, feeling smaller than I had a few minutes earlier, wondering what part of me I needed to hide better next time. Looking back now, decades later, I realize how early that lesson arrived. Obedience didn't come from understanding. It came from anticipation, from learning the weight of disappointment before it was even fully explained. That moment wasn't the worst one. It wasn't even unusual. It was just one of many. But it carried something with it, something quiet, something that stayed. Our house looked like any other American home on the street. A small front yard, a driveway that always stayed clean. Inside, everything had its place. The furniture didn't move much. The walls held family photos and school pictures, all neatly framed. From the outside, it was a good home, and in many ways it was. There was food on the table, clothes were clean, schedules were followed. But beneath all of that was a constant awareness that rules mattered more than feelings, and order mattered more than comfort. I grew up learning how to wait. Waiting became second nature. Waiting for permission, waiting for instructions, waiting for the right moment to speak, if that moment ever came. Mornings were quiet. The day started early, and everyone knew their role. I learned to listen for the sounds of the house waking up, the footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the coffee maker, the turning of pages from the newspaper. Those sounds told me when it was safe to move, when it was better to stay still a little longer. There was a certain way to sit at the table, a certain way to hold utensils, a certain pace to eating. Talking wasn't forbidden, but it was unnecessary. Silence was easier. Silence didn't invite correction. I watched closely. I watched how my father carried himself, how he moved through the house with purpose, how he expected things to be done without being reminded. His presence alone shaped the room. Even when he wasn't speaking, I felt him. School wasn't much different. I followed rules there, too. I stayed in line. I raised my hand. I did my work carefully. Teachers liked me because I didn't cause trouble. I didn't ask many questions. I learned that being unnoticed was a kind of safety. At home, praise was rare, but mistakes were remembered. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make sure they weren't repeated. Evenings were the hardest. The day slowed down, but the tension didn't leave. Homework was done quietly. I checked my answers twice, sometimes 3 times, not because I wanted to be perfect, but because I wanted to avoid attention. Attention usually meant correction. Correction meant that same tight feeling in my chest, that same silence afterward. I listened more than I spoke. I learned the tone of disappointment before the words were spoken. A sigh, a pause, a look that lingered a second too long. Those were enough. They told me I had crossed an invisible line. Over time, I became careful in ways other children didn't seem to be. I measured my steps. I measured my words. I measured myself. There were no open conversations about feelings, not because feelings were bad, but because they didn't seem necessary. The rules covered everything. Do what's expected, don't make excuses, learn from mistakes. These ideas weren't wrong on their own, but they left little room for questions, little room for comfort, little room for being unsure. I remember lying in bed at night, listening to the house settle, the quiet clicks and creaks as it cooled. I replayed moments from the day, wondering if I had missed something, wondering if I had done something that would be brought up later. My mind stayed busy even when my body was still. Sleep came slowly because part of me stayed alert, even in the dark. That was childhood for me. Not chaos, not cruelty, just control, just structure, just the steady pressure to be better, quieter, more careful. I didn't think of it as unusual at the time. It was simply how things were. It was normal. It was home. And I learned how to fit myself into it, piece by piece, even if it meant leaving parts of myself behind, without realizing it. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with noise or chaos. It came quietly, almost politely, the way most important moments in that house did. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that should have passed without leaving a mark. The light outside was steady, not too bright, not too dim. The house was calm. Too calm, maybe. I remember thinking that if I moved carefully enough, if I stayed within the lines, the day would end without trouble. But trouble didn't need drama to exist. It only needed expectation. I had made a mistake. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just something small that didn't meet the standard. I didn't even realize it right away. That was often the case. The rules were so deeply woven into daily life that sometimes you only discovered them after crossing them. When my father noticed, he didn't react immediately. That pause was always worse than the reaction itself. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual, as if deciding how much of his disappointment to reveal. He asked a question, calmly, clearly, the kind of question that already carried the answer inside it. I tried to explain, but my voice sounded thinner than I expected. Words didn't come easily when I was nervous. They still don't. As I spoke, I could feel myself shrinking inside, already bracing for what was coming next. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because I knew the pattern. He listened, or at least he stood there while I spoke. His face didn't change much. That was another thing I learned early on. Emotion didn't show itself easily in him. When it did, it was controlled, measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He simply told me in that same steady tone that what I had done was unacceptable, that it showed a lack of attention, a lack of responsibility. Words like that landed heavy, even without force. I remember standing there, my eyes fixed on a spot just past his shoulder. I didn't want to look directly at him. Looking felt like a challenge. Looking felt like an invitation for more correction. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, each tick marking time I couldn't control. Then came the part that stayed with me, not because of what happened, but because of what shifted inside me. He explained the consequence, slowly, clearly. There was no anger in his voice, but there was firmness, certainty, the kind that left no room for discussion. I nodded as he spoke, even though part of me wasn't fully listening anymore. My body was reacting before my mind caught up. My shoulders tightened. My hands felt cold. I could feel my heartbeat in places I wasn't used to feeling it. As he finished, there was a pause. Just a moment, but that moment stretched. It felt like standing at the edge of something and not knowing how deep it was. I realized then that I wasn't confused about what I had done. I was confused about who I was supposed to be. The mistake wasn't just a mistake anymore. It felt like evidence. Evidence that I wasn't careful enough, not good enough, not paying enough attention. When he turned away, the conversation ended without ceremony.
No reassurance, no softening of the edges, just the expectation that I would carry the lesson with me and not repeat it. I stood there alone, the room suddenly feeling larger and emptier at the same time. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I didn't ask questions, I simply absorbed it. What I didn't understand at the time was that something else had happened too, something quieter than the correction itself. A small door inside me closed, not all the way, just enough to change how things felt from that point on. After that day, I became more than careful. I became watchful, not just of my actions, but of myself. I started checking my thoughts before my words. I started rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened. I paid attention to every shift in tone, every pause, every look that might signal disappointment. I didn't wait to be corrected anymore. I corrected myself in advance. The house didn't change. The rules didn't change. My father didn't suddenly become harsher or colder. In fact, from the outside, nothing looked different at all. But inside me, something had moved. Trust, once shaken, doesn't always announce its departure. It just slowly steps back, leaving space where comfort used to be. I remember sitting alone later that evening, going over the moment again and again, not because I wanted to rebel or push back, but because I wanted to understand how to avoid that feeling in the future, that heavy, sinking awareness that I had failed at something important without fully knowing how. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again, not that specific mistake, and not that feeling. From then on, obedience became automatic, not thoughtful, not reflective, just automatic. I followed rules not because I believed in them, but because they kept things quiet. Quiet felt safe. Quiet meant no long pauses, no serious conversations, no reminders that I had fallen short. I stopped bringing questions to my father. Questions felt risky. They suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty wasn't something that was welcomed. I stopped sharing small details about my day. Details invited opinions, and opinions often came with correction. I learned to give short answers, polite answers, answers that ended the conversation quickly. What hurt the most wasn't the discipline itself, it was the realization that understanding wasn't part of the process. The lesson was clear: do better next time. But there was no space to ask why the mistake mattered or how to approach things differently beyond simply being more careful. Growth was expected, but guidance was limited. I didn't think of it as unfair back then. I thought of it as normal. That's what made it so effective. When something feels normal, you don't question it. You adjust to it. You adapt. And adaptation, when done quietly enough, can look a lot like strength from the outside. But inside, it felt like something fragile was being held too tightly. I became good at reading rooms, good at sensing moods, good at staying out of the way. These skills served me well in some ways. Teachers praised my discipline. Adults called me mature for my age. They didn't see the cost. Neither did I, not yet. That moment didn't break me. It didn't scar me in any visible way. It simply redirected me. It taught me that love and approval were connected to performance, that closeness was conditional, that being understood mattered less than being correct. These weren't lessons spoken out loud, but they were learned all the same. Years later, I can still feel that afternoon when I think about it. Not the details, but the weight. The way the air felt heavier, the way my voice sounded smaller in my own ears, the way I decided, without fully realizing it, to keep more of myself hidden. That was the day obedience stopped being something I did and became something I was. And once that shift happened, it was hard to tell where the rules ended and I began.
After that day, the house stayed the same on the outside. The furniture didn't move, the routines didn't change. My father still left for work at the same time, meals were still eaten at the table, the television still stayed off most nights. If someone were looking in from the outside, they wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. But inside me, everything had slowed down. Silence settled in first. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels careful. I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was measuring every word before it reached my mouth. I learned how to pause before answering questions, not to think of the best answer, but the safest one. I watched faces more closely than ever. I paid attention to tone, to posture, to the way footsteps sounded in the hallway. I became very good at waiting. Waiting for permission, waiting for approval, waiting for the moment when it felt safe to exist without being corrected. I didn't rush into rooms anymore. I didn't interrupt conversations. I didn't ask for things unless I was sure the answer would be yes, and even then I asked carefully, as if my words needed to earn their place. At school, teachers called me quiet, well-behaved, focused. They said I was easy to manage. I followed instructions. I didn't cause trouble. I sat where I was told and did what was expected. On paper, I was doing everything right. Inside, though, I felt like I was always standing a few steps back from myself, watching, adjusting, holding things in. At home, I learned how to move through rooms without drawing attention. I knew which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. I knew when to speak and when to stay silent. I knew how to answer questions in a way that didn't invite follow-ups. Short sentences became my habit. Nods replaced explanations. I didn't stop caring. That's the part people often misunderstand. I cared deeply. I cared so much that I didn't want to risk doing anything wrong. Caring for me turned into caution, and caution slowly turned into distance. I stopped sharing small joys. If something made me happy, I kept it to myself. Happiness felt fragile, like it could be questioned or corrected. I stopped sharing worries too. Worries invited attention, and attention often led to guidance that felt more like judgment. It was easier to carry things quietly than to explain them. Over time, that quiet became a shield. It protected me from correction, but it also kept others out. Even when my father spoke to me calmly, even when there was no immediate reason to be afraid, my body stayed tense, my shoulders stayed tight, my mind stayed alert. I didn't relax easily anymore. Trust changed shape. It didn't disappear completely, but it became conditional. I trusted that rules would be enforced. I trusted that expectations would be clear. What I didn't trust was the space in between, the space where mistakes lived, the space where questions belonged. That space felt unsafe. I remember moments when my father would try to connect in his own way, asking about school, commenting on something I had done well. Those moments mattered, but they didn't reach me the way they might have before. I received praise carefully, as if it might be taken back. I didn't lean into it. I didn't build on it. I simply accepted it and moved on. Emotionally, I began to withdraw without realizing it. I didn't laugh as loudly. I didn't react as strongly. I kept my expressions neutral. Neutral felt safe. Neutral didn't draw attention. Neutral didn't need explaining. Friends noticed, even if they couldn't name it. They would ask why I was so serious, why I never talked about home. I didn't have an answer for them. Home wasn't something I knew how to describe. It wasn't bad, it wasn't cruel, it was controlled, and control is hard to explain without sounding ungrateful. As the years passed, obedience became second nature. I didn't think about rules anymore. I felt them. They lived in my posture, in my tone, in the way I approached decisions. I anticipated consequences before they existed. I adjusted before anyone asked me to. That constant adjustment came at a cost. I began to lose track of what I actually wanted. Preferences felt dangerous. Opinions felt unnecessary. It was easier to align with expectations than to explore uncertainty. I became good at fitting in, but not at standing out. There were moments, late at night, when I would sit alone and feel a quiet ache I couldn't explain. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like absence, like something that should have been there wasn't. I didn't know what it was at the time. I just knew that I felt distant, even from myself. I watched other families and felt confused.
Some seemed loud, some seemed relaxed, some children talked back without fear. I didn't envy them exactly, but I wondered what it felt like to speak freely, to make a mistake and not carry it for years, to be corrected without feeling reduced. At home, I continued to do what was expected. My grades stayed steady, my behavior stayed controlled. On the surface, I was successful. Inside, though, I was shrinking my world to fit the rules. I avoided situations that felt unpredictable. I avoided conversations that felt emotional. I avoided anything that might expose uncertainty. Silence became my language. Not an angry silence, not a dramatic one, just a steady, practiced quiet. The kind that keeps things smooth, the kind that keeps people from asking too many questions. Over time, people stopped expecting much from me emotionally. I was reliable, not expressive, dependable, not open. That distance didn't just exist between me and my father, it spread outward. I felt it with teachers, with friends, later with people who tried to get close. I kept conversations safe, surface level, controlled. I didn't know how to let people see uncertainty without feeling like I was doing something wrong. Looking back, I can see how early it started, how one moment taught me not just how to behave, but how to feel, or rather how not to feel openly. Obedience without connection became my default. I followed rules well, but I didn't feel seen inside them. There was no single moment where I decided to pull away. It happened slowly over years of quiet adjustments. Each time I chose silence over explanation. Each time I chose caution over curiosity. Each time I chose to be correct instead of being understood. By the time I reached adulthood, that silence felt normal. I didn't think of it as loss. I thought of it as maturity, strength, self-control. Those words fit neatly over what I felt, even if they didn't fully explain it. It would take many more years before I realized that silence, while useful, had also taken something from me. But at the time, all I knew was that being quiet kept things steady, and in a house where steadiness mattered more than anything, that felt like the safest choice I could make.
As an adult, I can finally look back without the tightness in my chest I used to feel. Time has softened the sharp edges. Distance has given me room to see things more clearly, not just from my own side, but from my father's as well. I understand now that he believed discipline was love. He grew up in a world where obedience meant survival, where being corrected early was seen as a gift, not a wound. He thought he was preparing me for a hard world, teaching me strength, teaching me control. In his mind, structure was safety, rules were protection, silence was respect. And in some ways, he wasn't wrong. Discipline did teach me responsibility. It taught me how to show up on time, how to follow through, how to keep my word. It gave me structure when life felt uncertain. Those lessons stayed with me, and I don't deny their value. They helped me function in a world that often rewards control and punishes hesitation. But discipline also took something quieter, something harder to name. It took my ease. It took my voice before I learned how to use it. It took the part of me that might have spoken without fear of being corrected. I didn't lose my ability to feel. I learned to hide it. I learned to filter myself so well that even I couldn't always tell where my true thoughts ended and expectations began. For a long time, I confused silence with strength. I confused obedience with maturity. I didn't realize that understanding and connection had been missing until I saw them in other places later in life. There is no anger when I say this now, just clarity. My father did the best he knew how with what he was given. He wasn't trying to take anything from me, he was trying to shape me. But shaping a child without understanding their inner world leaves marks that don't show on the surface, marks that take years to notice and even longer to understand. What I've learned since then is simple, but it took a lifetime to reach. Children don't just need rules, they need to be heard. They need to feel safe asking questions, safe making mistakes, safe being unsure. Obedience can teach behavior, but understanding teaches trust. Today, when I think about that house, I don't just remember the rules. I remember the quiet, the careful way I learned to exist. And I carry both lessons with me. The discipline helped me stand on my own. The silence taught me what I never want to pass on unchanged. If this story stirred something in you, you're not alone. Many of us carry pieces of our childhood quietly, without ever saying them out loud. If you feel comfortable, you might share what growing up was like for you, or what lessons staying with you the longest. Sometimes, simply naming those memories helps us understand them in a new way.